G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic final day of 2024. It is New Year's Eve, or maybe even New Year's Day when you are watching this, and I cannot believe that the year is over. One thing we will be going over in this video today is at the beginning of 2024, I made some predictions over this year, or what I thought would unfold. So we'll be going over that. And look, I will be eating some of my words, but it'll be interesting to look at what has actually happened as well, now that we know. And I would love to see some other bloggers do this with their predictions that they made, especially when some of them even had time frames. Now, look, as I said, it is the final day of 2024, and it's been a big year. It was going really well, and it sort of fell off, at least for me at the end. In the past few months have just been massive for myself. Surgery, the tumours worse, chemotherapy, everything piling on that. And I just want to thank you guys from the bottom of my heart for everything you have done for me over this very challenging period. Yes, I've been living with this tumour for a number of years, but things have really started heading a bit south very recently at the tail end of this year. So thank you guys very much. There's almost 200,000 of you. I can never thank you all. And I can never even thank, the ones who their constructive criticism has forced me to become better at what I do. And that is one of the biggest self-reflections I have had through this year. Looking back at the video that we're going to look at of my predictions, we'll do at the end of the video, is the improvements I think I've made over this year about my knowledge, my ability to analyze a situation, and I think an improvement in critical thinking when there is a situation as well. But that is forced from you guys. It is forced from the market, and I really appreciate that and you guys holding me to account, and I hope that I'm holding myself to account as well. And that's one of the reasons I'll be going over the predictions, and I'll have a new prediction video in the next few days. But thank you and happy New Year's. Now, legends, of course, you're not here to listen to my spiel. You're here to look at the updates. Now, of course, I will be showing you the maps. I will also be showing you some geolocations, different maps, different sources, going over that. We have a separate folder outside of the maps, but we're going to be looking at Kursk and where there has been an advancement back into some occupied area in Kursk, but also one of my guys behind the scenes who helps me with some analysis, basically saying, look, I'm going to push on against what you have said about the strategic relevancy of Kursk. So we're going to look at what he says and where he has a separate opinion in some areas to myself. So that's very interesting. I have a miscellaneous folder. We're going to be looking at new US aid to Ukraine, Russian recruiting, and we're also going to look at strikes against Crimea and in Kursk as well. We need to talk about an open letter that Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico has put towards the European Union, the European community, saying about what the effect will be if Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky does cut off gas transit within the next few days. But as well, before we look at that, I have another one, and there's a lot in the background that you don't see in my videos, of another one of my experts saying what his opinion and his experience is with European economies and how the flow-on effects can happen, because it's not just it costs this much for gas, therefore we compensate you this much for gas. It can be, yes, but because the gas is more expensive, it costs us 3 times the amount to make this, therefore we are not going to be as competitive with the developing world. So that will all be in one around Slovakia, Ukraine, EU, Russian energy, and we're going to be looking at sanctions and where a new pipeline is going from Russia to China. We're going to talk about negotiations and future wars, an extension of what we spoke about yesterday from another one of my guys behind the scenes. We also need to look at relationships with Syria, both Russian and Ukrainian as well. So, of course, we have a lot to get into. So let's start in the miscellaneous folder. This shouldn't take us too long. So, as I am filming this at the moment, there is said to be both airborne and seaborne drone attacks towards Crimea. This is the only photograph we have at this point. And this is said to have been a sea drone being destroyed by Russian fire in and around Sevastopol. But exactly what this is at this point in time, we don't know. The success of that attack, we also don't know. Currently, what is happening at the moment as well is there are several Iskanders have been fired on Kyiv. That said, with any of those strikes, it's almost impossible to know because of the screws tightened down on the media and reporting of any of that. Just look at what has occurred. Deep state, that is happening everywhere from the biggest to smallest media too. So strikes, whether Russian or Ukrainian, almost impossible to get a solid idea of what the battle damage assessment actually was. And in Kursk, in Lugov, there has been alleged HIMARS strikes against the railway here, said to be against a bunker holding both Russian and North Korean soldiers and commanders. Again, from this footage, it is not completely clear exactly what has occurred here, but said to be a HIMARS strike there. If anything more comes on that, I will update you, but people always get into me about ignoring strikes. There are strikes both ways all the time, and I try and have strategically important or relevant things there and stuff we can confirm, which is very hard with their strikes and the control of the media around this. Now, we did say yesterday, Zelensky had said there was going to be a large amount of aid coming from the US, and this is from the White House, that Biden is announcing $2.5 billion in security assistance for Ukraine. This is going to come in two $1.25 billion packages from two different spots over two different times. I always forget that Biden is still in power, but in 20 days, we will have a new administration entering the White House, which will come into my predictions video tomorrow as well about what will happen there. This is what has been announced. So we have things for air defense as well as, of course, Stinger missiles, air defense, but an offensive capacity there as well. HIMARS 155 artillery, UAVs, we have satellite comms, commercial satellite imagery services. These are very, very important because this is very expensive, but giving Ukraine the ability to use satellite imagery for other missile types such as HIMARS, ATACMS, Storm Shadow, or Scalp. This is, of course, is where Russia is pointing fingers going, well, if Ukraine is firing these systems and you're helping on this back end, you can't say that you're stepping out of this and we're not involved at all. Now, this is from the MOD, UK's MOD, their update about Ukraine, their intel report. And there's some interesting bits and pieces in this. But if you really want to look at a video about how the Russian military has grown over the last 12 months, I do implore you to go and watch History Legends' most recent or second most recent video. The only criticism I would have for History Legends in that, and that video is fantastic, but is that it doesn't show the PPP, the purchasing power parity, as often as I think it should have. Now, I know that is nitpicking, but it is important when a Westerner like me hears, $1,000 bonus here. I think it's important to show, yes, but how much is that? Yes, it might show a monthly salary or this or that, but I think that is something you should maybe work out yourself as you are watching that through. I think it will become more relevant to how enticing these actually are. And I know it was done on a few occasions. Okay. In late November 24, Russia passed a law that would allow military personnel who signed up after the 1st of December 24 to have their loan debt written off. The write-off would cover loans of up to 10 million rubles, approximately US of $94,500, and would apply to spouses. But the important part in this is we need to go the purchasing power parity. And that is from ruble to USD, the equivalent of writing off about 375,000 USD. So that is incredibly enticing. And why is this? Well, Alex goes over this of a slump in recruiting. Russia has been recruiting well over 1,000 new members a day, but there has been a slump heading into then November, December. But he points out that potentially this is just the Christmas, New Year holiday period that people want to spend with their families, and maybe this will lift after that. But if it doesn't, Russia is going to have to keep increasing that money. What does, as their third point here, does increase financial pressure on Russian banks. How close is this to collapse, like many are saying? Well, I'd refer to my video with a professional economist, not some bloke showing a Google screenshot on Twitter of exactly what is happening there. And it is having pressure. There is financial pressure. Is it dire that it's about to collapse? according to him, no, it is not. And furthermore, he believes that Russia could turn it up a few notches on spending. But as things progress, I will get him back on and we'll discuss about the new things have come like this. The incentives are almost certainly intended to reduce the potential for Russia to have to enact further mobilizations. And this is one of the things people talk about mobilizing. Russia is not mobilizing. Russian forces at the moment, they are recruiting. Yes, there's massive incentive, but it is also working, and that is backfilling that manpower. And in my opinion, Russia is, well, the numbers show Russia has grown their military, so they are well above a meeting replacement rate of KIA, WIA, MIA on the front line at this point in time, at least in my opinion, because the numbers, they're hard to get from anywhere. Kremlin numbers, Kiev numbers, I'm sorry, but the specifics given on killed and wounded and even recruited can be difficult, but we have seen that Russia has grown its military, so in my eyes, that would mean that the replacement rate has been met, or if it has grown, has then exceeded this. Now, let's get into the, or do you want to do Kursk or maps? Let's do the maps first, and then we'll do the analysis of Kursk and potential for future wars also. So, of course, here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Of course, the red check on this map is area where Russia is occupying over the last 24 hours. The blue, there's none on it today. Well, no new blue on it, but that would be ground that Ukraine has taken back in the past 2 weeks. But where we'll come up first is here in Terny, and this is a very important area due to the natural barriers of some of the waterways sitting in here, but also the difficulty for logistics. So we see there has definitely been some Russian gain in here, but we go to another Ukrainian map, in this case Noel reports, and this is different again. So Terny, Kremenar direction, it has worsened. Geolocated footage shows Russians have occupied Terny and moved south towards Yampelivka. But more worrying, they've managed to get a foothold on the western bank of the reservoir of the Ivanivka. So this is concerning. So there's only a little bit of grey zone shown here, but what he is showing is Terny, where these crossings are, Ivanivka, that the Russians have gone across here. So this one here that's shown still in green zone and up towards Ivanivka, getting a foothold across there. And from a Ukrainian source, that is bad news in this direction. So let's have a look at some other areas. There's no changes to the north of here. We'll move down, of course, then we have the Toretsk front. No changes shown on this map today, but we do have a Syriac map. I will say Syriac has said he's a few days behind at the moment, just due to time off with Christmas and working as well. So we'll have a look in here. Russian army made advances towards the Tedikon mine in this direction as well. So you can see where these mines are, that it's basically, I say in this area, the grey zone of which Deep State is showing is the red zone of what Syriac is showing. So we'll continue moving our way down. Now, what we'll see is this is Pokrovsk, and to the east of Pokrovsk, we can see some red in here. Actually, for the second day in a row, we are seeing this, and this is further confirmed by Syriac maps, same exact locations in here that the Russian army is advancing in this direction. And as you can see, this is on one of the other flanks of Pokrovsk, Vinograd. Again, Russian military could follow suit and just work on flanks and envelop. Of course, the southern and western flank of Pokrovsk is far more developed than the east or growing north, but we can see movements in this direction, and at this point in time is level with the center or even the northern suburbs of Pokrovsk. But we can confirm that that has moved there. We come down to what I'm calling Pokrovsk actual. This is where the Russian military is pushing for Udashny. Cuts off another area of logistics, fire control onto the last remaining main service route in here, the MSR, into Pokrovsk as well. And when we open the Pokrovsk actual map, and you can see movement on this map, 3 out of 4 that are shown is in very similar directions. Now, there are some changes like Zelene under control and Lysivkia creeping up in here, as you can see by right here. But realistically, this map is showing very, very similar of movements today and continuing moving forward in Pokrovsk. Now, there are some pages saying that, of course, this is the border with the Dnipro Oblast as well, that there are withdrawals from the Ukrainian armed forces back to the final defensive positions in here, and some are reading in that potentially this is gearing up for a Ukrainian offensive into here, and others are saying no, this is strategic withdrawals to try and attrit down as moving rearwards. And this would have been the best case if fortifications were up to scratch. Many are still saying Ukraine is pulling back methodically and attriting down the Russians. Now, I'm not saying that that hasn't or isn't happening in some areas, but the main thing of why that isn't as successful, anywhere near as successful as it could be, is the lack of built up, fortified, reinforced areas and how quickly some of those have fallen too. So let's move down to the south a little bit, and the Solzhenitsyn pocket has closed up. That is no surprise. I believe that's probably been closed up for some time, and then the Russian military has pushed into Shevchenko towards the east of Stary Turny. They haven't started a southern push here. Again, this goes into my idea that it was the Ukrainian controlled demolition that took down this dam here and has made that more difficult. But what you can see is a second large envelopment now occurring in this sector. And if we measure this as rough as possible, about 6 kilometers, but that is really not far. Drones easily working in that 10-click range. We see Kurakhove, more control through here by the Russian forces, and to the south, of course, spreading out from when Uspanivki, the pocket that fell a few weeks ago, has also closed up. So we are seeing some significant shifts around here. And when I say significant shifts, people are going, but it's in a few square kilometres. Yes, but it is relative to what we have seen move over the past 2 years. This is still significant. And you can see then Kurakhove, Stary Turny, and Uspanivki, all of these line up with where there are further movements on the map, confirmed with Syriac as well. Now, Kurakhove in here, let's just have a look, because I do have a geolocation right in here. So right on the outskirts of the grey zone here, just in these buildings, although some other people had said it's down in this grey zone here, but the most trusted one, I believe, is here. We do see that there was a Russian flag flown, then confirming then presence and occupation of that area that I believe to be right here or down in here. I'm 95% sure it's here, 5% it's here, but either way is in grey zone shown on this map. Now, of course, Kursk, something that I have been very vocal about that I do not understand and I think is a massive strategic mistake for Ukraine, is the movement into Kursk. Now, I would have said it was a strategic victory, if it was an in and out over a couple of days. Get some POWs, to pick off the easy mobilised territorial guard who was here, rather than go in and hold and more. And now I believe that this is actually working in Russia's favour, as Ukraine has assets, men in here that it needs desperately in the collapsing front lines in the south and the east. And as this starts, over 50%, I believe at this point in time, is coming back under control of the Russians. And there's lost a little bit of ground here. Remember, it was 482 at one point, and it's now 481.9. Absolutely negligible amount of ground change, but still, Russia is pushing back on this. But I had a friend of mine say, look, I want to have a separate opinion here somewhat to yourself based on things that I had said, and I'll definitely present this. But firstly, let's look at where the map is. Of course, the main centre in here is Sudzha. The problem is there's really one main road. That creates a hell of a lot of problems, especially around, if you look at some of the groups talking about casualty evacuation here, can be almost impossible. And the logistics are going to get harder and harder and harder as the weather continues to deteriorate for land armoured movements, as well as the condition of roads and earth will further deteriorate with strikes as well. But let's have a look at what then Noel Reports is showing in here. And if we just come in, you can see where the train line is running down here and this road is turning. So just on the inside of this road, and this other road where it crosses, so right where my cursor is here, saying that that is where the Russian forces have had some level of success, and saying that Sudzha is somewhat turning in Russia's favour as they grind back ground in that location. Now, Again, we have a different map here. This is Syriac maps, but again, anything with Syriac is more difficult to see because the red is shown as the whole thing of Russia, and then the blue here is where Ukraine is, but okay, let's go with it anyway. We can see where this road then turns down here, said road, that Russia has made back some position. So just for an idea, where my cursor is now is where no other report said, where Syriac is saying is in here. Again, what I will say here is then I believe that there definitely was movement in this direction. How much? Well, we don't really know. Let's get into what my contact has said about Kursk. This is very interesting and brings up some really great points. As I said, I'd like to play devil's advocate for a bit. I agree that in operational terms, the Kursk offensive has been a failure. Whatever its military objectives were, it hasn't achieved much, and it has been very costly. But you often remind viewers that propaganda is used to support military operations, not the other way around, and that in attritional war, any terrain that does not have a vital industrial centre is irrelevant. In just about every attritional war, this is correct, in my opinion. But in this one, what is Ukraine's vital industrial centre? I'd argue that it is precisely propaganda. Sure, Ukraine has coal mines, steel plants, but most of their military equipment comes from Western factories and stockpiles that Ukraine cannot access directly. The only way to get more is through Western politicians who must make their public opinions into account at least to some degree. So, saying that there isn't a vital industrial centre here to get that industrial equipment, to get that military equipment, the West is that industrial centre. So through propaganda, through politics, through informational, through battlefield successes, they're appealing to Western leaders to get more of this. So still in line with what I've said, but it is different to what we then presume in a typical attritional war. Very interesting. But this is only part of the story. Ukrainian forces also need support, or at least consent from Ukrainian population. Ukrainians must feel that mass mobilisation will lead to some kind of positive outcome. If popular consent were lost, the military and state would soon collapse. I unfortunately can't seem to find these data anymore, but before the Kursk offensive, there was a noticeable slump in Ukrainian morale, with more and more people in favour of a negotiated settlement. The willingness to fight was eroding. Ukrainians hadn't received any good news in a long time, and many clearly felt like giving up. The Kursk offensive reversed this trend, at least for a bit, but I think this could backfire even worse. It gave Western sponsors something good to talk about. The media went crazy over it. It was a brilliant PR move. And when Ukraine ran out of steam in Kursk, most outlets simply stopped talking about it. So that PR that gave then Western media outlets and Western sponsors for military aid what is Ukraine's industrial centre was incredibly relevant. So therefore it goes back on the propaganda can be the military operation within itself. This is why I really appreciate those that work behind the scenes of some stuff. So was Kursk worth it? On the face of it, no. But truly answering this requires knowing what would have happened without it, which is very difficult. So we don't know what would happen if those tens of thousands of troops and the thousands or hundreds of vehicles remained out in the south and the east. Ukrainian leadership may have reasoned that if they didn't do something, everything might collapse. For all I know, perhaps they were right. Let's go on the final slide. Obvious but perhaps necessary addendum to my comments about Kursk. Of course, everything the Kursk offensive brought to Ukraine was purchased at the expense of the future. When all is said and done, we may well find that it did nothing but delay the inevitable, while adding more dead bodies to the pile. So we will see what the effect of Kursk is over the coming next weeks and months, negotiations or military victories or losses on the front line. But I really would like to thank him for sending that across. Now, from another one of my contacts, let's talk about negotiations and future wars. And I shared this yesterday, and this was talking about Ukraine could possibly negotiate with Putin, but the question is of the position of which Putin and Russia is in at this point in time. These then Western analysts are saying, well, why would Putin come to the table? How can we get them to the table, and what is stopping going to Romania or this or that? And what I spoke about was these experts in here, they don't understand that the one constant for Russia was Ukraine not joining NATO, and they also don't understand what exactly is stopping the movement of Russia into areas like Romania or the Baltics or Poland or whatever is also NATO. So just missed that whole piece. And one of my very experienced guys said to me, this expert is a fucking idiot. Not clever enough to maneuver Moscow into concessions. What trump card, pun intended, does he expect to play here? So not clever enough to maneuver Moscow into concessions, that's not going to be a point of negotiation. No matter how good of a negotiator you are going to be at this point in time, why right now would Moscow be looking at territory concessions at this point in time? From a position of power, they're not going to make the territorial concession as they're gaining tens of square kilometres on the front line every day or every second day. I think we just got so used to being on top and controlling the game that it's hard to accept someone else winning, even if we're just spectators and slipping our favourite, the odd ace, for his hand. So exactly here, may be difficult to say, look, we are not going to be in potentially the position of power if negotiations happen in then 20 days or around this. Continues. Russian victory might embolden some other players, but China was on about taking Taiwan for decades. And this is what this article said, was that if Russia is allowed to take Ukraine or take parts and concessions, then it's just going to embolden other countries to do the same. But what it's saying here was China's been going on about this well before then February of 2022. North Korea has been talking about a forced reunification since the 50s. These things will come in time regardless of what success or failure Russia has. Not saying the success of these, but eventually these may come. Doesn't matter what Putin's outcome is in Ukraine. But the US being busy elsewhere is a better time to move on these spaces. Israel has grabbed territory from Syria and now has capabilities to strike Iran with greater efficiency and effectiveness. If they kick off against Iran, it might draw the US in. Turkey is exerting its power in the region too. Anyone want to start talking about Africa? That continent never fails to kick off another war or be used as proxies. Keep an eye on Venezuela, because Eric Prince and Trump do. 2025 is going to be loud, even if the Russians sign a treaty and go into refit and rearm mode. So what is happening here, things are still going to happen in other areas regardless. So there is a bit of a, if this does, then the world is going to be at war. And what he is saying is no, these other countries have been talking about this for some time, and further proxies around the world are going to be happening, even if Russia were to win or lose or anything in here. China's not going, oh, because of that, therefore, no. It may be, I think, more China going, we're waiting because there's so many arms being used here by both Russia and America, our other two main competitors. They will disarm themselves through this, both economically and militarily, and then we may make a move at some point on this. Now, talking of further proxies, let's talk about Syria and how Syria and groups within this are used as proxies from bloody here to Istanbul, to Washington, to Moscow, to now Kyiv as well. That Syria is just the home of proxy war. And we see this today from the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Sybiha, with Ahmed al-Sharaa, discussed in Damascus, so a meeting here. Now, you can't tell me this guy doesn't look like a bearded Zelensky. You can't tell me he doesn't. But what we need to say about this bloke here too is that he had a $10 million or 16 million Australian dollar reward that led to the arrest of him from the US. Now, this has very recently been dropped, but at the end of the day, he is the leader of a declared terrorist organisation. In May 2018, the US State Department added HTS to the front's existing 2012 designation for a foreign terrorist organisation. That is still there, whether you like it or not. The enemy of your enemies are your friends. Maybe so, but getting wrapped up in all of this can, well, historically in Syria can just be bad news. On Monday, 30th December, during his visit to Syria, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Ukraine Ahmed Sybiha and talks in Damascus with the leadership of the Syrian administration. He congratulated the Syrian people on the victory of the revolution. President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, we're here with you. We're ready to help the Syrian people because Ukraine is interested in stable Syria and development of mutually beneficial cooperation. No, Ukraine is interested in reduced Russian power in the region. And I'm guessing so would a lot of other three-letter agencies. Let's continue here. Readiness to open new page of bilateral relations between the countries. Syria will receive 500 tons of Ukrainian flour for 167,000 people for a month. So delivering some food aid in here too. The minister expressed hope that Syria will become a state that respects international law, in particular the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. This is one of the main criticisms, is respect for humanitarian and international law is not just territorial integrity or sovereignty. There are all other pieces in here, although sometimes is nitpicked. But what I will say with this is also should respect the international law of mass executions and I can't say the word, but you can probably read it in here, that the soldiers under HTS, the militants, have been carrying out en masse that we have seen. He expressed his belief that the elimination of Russian presence in Syria in the strategic perspective would contribute to the stability not only of the Syrian state but the entire Middle East and Africa. Even this process will take time. The Russian and Assad regime support each other because their foundation is violence and torture. We're ready to share experience on collection of evidence, investigation, work, war criminals to justice for the crimes they have committed. So wanting to work with Syria here, well, work with then this now unelected leader of Syria. It was going to take many years apparently for elections to come through, but this isn't about trying to give humanitarian aid or build relation in this. It's to try and reduce Russia's influence there, whether by their military leaving or by then Ukrainian grain coming in rather than, or flour coming in rather than Russian there for then hybrid unconventional warfare and power across borders also. But let's then have a look at this that's come out on the same day. Syria's new elections and draft constitution, that the elections could take up to 4 years, and the new constitution would require at around 3 years. This is said to then a news outlet as well. But in this, Syria and Russia after then the Assad regime. Well, Russia expected to withdraw from Syria after years of supporting the al-Assad regime. Al-Sharaa highlighted strategic interest with the second most powerful country in the world. We don't want Russia to exit Syria in a way that undermines its relationship with the country. So saying again that they're the second most powerful country. What I will say here, Syria is playing both sides of the fence to get maximum amount of aid and the maximum amount of leverage. And that may mean pinning countries then against each other, but I believe that is exactly what they're doing. And I don't think that Russia will be leaving en masse at any time soon, especially with things like that being said. So let's look at economy, gas transit, Ukraine, EU, Russia, and externally actually through Kazakhstan and China as well. Now, then another one of my guys said, while I'm at it, you mentioned the risk of division within the EU. I'm no economist, but I'm sure this is a bit too simplistic. But my understanding of Germany's economic model of recent decades is that the country takes advantage of its vast Central and Eastern European hinterland to outsource production of low-value goods and products, while the same hinterland provides an affordable source of labour through immigration for high-value products made in Germany. It then takes advantage of its high productivity to flood EU markets with very competitive goods. Simultaneously, the country benefits from the fact that the euro is dragged down by less productive eurozone economies, so that it's weaker than a Deutschmark would be if Germany weren't in the eurozone. So using countries around which may be poorer and the euro dragging that down because they use them to take advantage of then the labour and cheaper production and industry that this then allows. Similar-ish to America using then, say, some Mexican labour. The US dragged down less, so it's weaker than the Deutschmark if they have one. This allows Germans to export outside the EU under favourable conditions. Thanks to all of this, even though Germany is a net contributor to the EU, playing in more than it is getting back, the EU has still been a profitable investment for Germany. Has been, because all this was predicted on the availability of cheap energy. In other words, Russian gas. Now that it's gone, this model doesn't work anymore, and the German economy is weakening. It's barely avoiding recession this quarter, if I'm not mistaken. Is the EU still a profitable investment for Germany? Perhaps more importantly, in a practical terms, will German voters believe that it is, especially in the context of a budget crisis? If the answer is no, what does this mean for the EU? And there are major players in the EU, and we've spoken about potential division in there as well as things become more expensive. It's not just the loss or what's being paid out, it's all the loss on the goods from cheap energy, not just what you're paying to have your aircon on or your heating on, but your factories too. How much more expensive does that come from goods being imported to goods being exported and bought? And we need to go over this of what Robert Fico, it's saying so weird, it sounds like Fico to me in my head, but of his open letter from the Prime Minister to EU representatives that he has posted then openly on his Facebook. As it's commonly known, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, unilaterally without any open consultations with European Union organs or affected member states, he announced that after the 1st of January 25, Ukraine will not provide any transited gas through its territory towards the Slovak Republic and for other subscribers in Western Europe. Prime Minister of Slovakia clearly stated that conclusion of contracts for the supply or transit of Russian gas is not prohibited at this stage under EU law, as it does not fall under EU sanctions, and import of Russian gas is currently not prohibited under the provisions of the Union law. So he's saying under the EU, this is not in the sanctions and it's not outside the law, and that Zelensky is working then unilaterally to do this and cut this off. I would like to personally mention that Ukrainian partners were also offered other variants of transit gas than Russian gas, but these were also rejected by the Ukrainian president. I'm not addressing you only as the Prime Minister of government of an EU member state who will be significantly financially damaged by this unilateral decision of the Ukrainian president. Remember that President Volodymyr Zelensky from Ukraine has also said and accused Slovakian Prime Minister of opening a second front against Ukraine, this being an energy front, which I've said that's a big thing to say towards an EU and NATO member. Prime Minister of the country, which is actively participating in vital discussions on how to maintain declining competitiveness of the EU in relation to other regions of the world, those developing nations. Exactly what is said from another guy in here of taking advantage of that energy, but now it's not in favourable conditions, that industry is not going to be as competitive. It is undoubtedly that the unilateral decision of the Ukrainian president will have significant negative impact on our joint European efforts and to keep up with rapidly developing countries of the world. Like I've said, many countries, wherever this thing was built, will be made for 99 cents. If it was built in Australia or the EU or America, would be significantly more expensive. Now, I think this is a machine translating error, but I don't know. I do not know whether the vaginal approach of the European Commission and the most of the member states comes from the fact that the economic impact of the interruption of the transit of Russian gas or other gas through Ukraine was not expertly analysed at all, and the whole thing was judged only ideologically, or whether analysis was carried out but was not openly discussed by member states, and the impact of the Ukrainian president's decision on the European economy are underestimated. So what he has said is either there has been an analysis carried out and gone, what is the impact going to be? He's saying you are underestimating this, or that people are fine with this because of ideological reasons rather than, I guess, the reality of how that may look, and that you're not really allowed to speak up against anything in here. In any case, I would like to present a clear position on behalf of the Slovak side, that especially now, at a time of complicated economic situation, when we approach a painful austerity measures, I believe it is absolutely necessary to analyse the economic impacts of significant decisions, and the positions are taken with a constant knowledge of the matter. He's asked then a Slovak energy company here, which is a dominant gas supplier in Slovakia, but also one of the major European gas traders, to provide me with an expert view on the impact of the termination of this transit of gas. Although the volume of gas transited through Ukraine accounts for only about 3.5% of gas consumption of the EU plus then Great Britain, or just Britain at this point. I think they've lost the title great over the past couple of years. Apologies, but this is the quantity that in different terms of the overall market situation results from the conformity situation in terms of demand satisfaction turns into tense situation. The interview traders estimate that the difference between continuing and stopping Russian gas transit through Ukraine constitutes at least 10 to 12 megawatt hours of gas for shops closed on key Dutch and German stock markets. This difference is also evidenced by the increase in gas prices from the level of about 35 euros per megawatt hour to the current level of 45 euros per megawatt hour. which can only be explained by the negative outlook related to the decision of the Ukrainian president. Again, take into account what I showed you in the very first here of how effects can then have a ripple out for the production, the cost, and the level of industry, therefore affecting economies, that some can have a major effect in other positions, he says here, for the Dutch and the Germans. In practice, EU 27 gas consumption at a level of around 4 billion megawatt hours, slightly under 400 billion cubic meters per year, means only on the price of gas, the additional cost of European households, businesses and public infrastructure to 40 to 50 billion euros on hand, after counting secondary effects on electricity prices. The EU27 will go to a total of 60 to 70 billion euro per year. Only in Germany, as the biggest European market, is 15 to 16 billion of euro on hand. There will be also a direct loss of transit fees of around 800 million for Ukraine. So, of course, they pay Ukraine for this transit through. The Ukrainian president considers this loss obviously insignificant, considering Ukraine's huge revenues from abroad and at least 400 million. So saying that although Ukraine is losing a hell of a lot of money for transit fees, they're not worrying about this. They're saying it is significant because of revenues that are given from other areas. And this is what Zelensky has gone on about, was Slovakia was offered compensation. Some are saying in and around the $500 million mark, and that Ukraine pay Slovakia around $200 million a year for then electricity. But what I believe Fitzo is getting at here is saying, yes, that may be just the price of the meter, but you're not taking into account then how much more expensive everything becomes to produce. And then, of course, more reliance on electricity, already have problems with producing enough electricity. These are huge problems. Just like the gentleman said, if Ukraine wants more electricity and Slovakia won't give it, should be leaning more towards Germany to reopen their nuclear power plants rather than pointing at Fitzo. So because if that gas goes, they may rely more on electricity, but this will have flow-on ripple effects for markets, especially to keep up with other developing countries around the world on industrial capacity. It's would be significantly higher to the introduced benchmark of the German and Dutch market. Very likely, the real possibility to export gas from Europe to Ukraine will cease to exist, and Ukraine will have to rely solely on its own mining. The Russian Federation's revenues from the continuation of gas transit through Ukraine will account for only 2 billion euros. So the continuation of gas is giving Russia 2 billion euros. That is a hell of a lot of money, but he's saying realistically the cost back on Europe is going to be significantly more. If I summarise the facts, we're coming to a conclusion that must be unacceptable for the European Union and its goals. Unilateral stoppage of transit through Ukraine towards Slovakia will cost European citizens, businesses and infrastructure tens of billions of euros per year. It'll cost Ukraine almost 800 million euros. And the possibility of importing gas from Europe and Slovakia per year of 400 million. On transit fees, and significantly over €1 billion on the price of commodity. The loss caused by the Russian Federation will only amount to around 2 billion euros. So 2 billion less euros going towards Russia. It's only 3% of all losses caused by the 27 EU member states. Not to mention that the Russian Federation will easily place such a small volume of gas in other markets to make up for this. Thus, the amount of losses for the Russian Federation may be close to zero. Impacts on EU competitiveness, I don't even want to comment. Again, I do see that he points at a very important part here, that was it looked at, was there, which part was it? Right in here. Was it looked at by experts analysing this, or then more from ideological views of the other EU member states? And I do think a lot of leaders act on emotion and ideology, which there's a lot of overlap in, rather than being complete realists. I'm probably at the nth degree of being a realist, and that probably drags me down to be able to see things from some views. But again, I believe that's where many are assessing here, is they have an idealist view rather than a realist view on many different things. At the end of this open letter, I dare to express my opinion that a silent acceptance of the Ukrainian president's unilateral decision is absolutely irrational and wrong, and will lead to tension and reciprocal measures. I also express the belief that it is in the interest of all EU citizens, and European efforts to support Ukraine should be carried out rationally and not in the form of self-destructive and extremely damaging EU gestures. So if you want to support Ukraine, great, but do it rationally, that's not self-destructive or damaging the EU. And like I've said, the biggest win for Russia and China would be, or the axis of upheaval countries, would be divisions in the EU and NATO, which I think the cracks are starting to form and form bloody crevasses that you may not see, but you may fall straight bloody through. For this reason, I would like to ask you, not only on behalf of the Slovak Republic, but above all on behalf of the entire European Union, to pay attention to this unprecedented situation and to attribute its urgent importance to relook at what is happening here. He spoke at, though, that Russia will find other markets, and this was then 6 days ago. Gas pipeline project to China via Kazakhstan is now underway from Russia to China via Kazakhstan. A new project being considered today, proposed by Russia together with Kazakh friends. This is a project to build a gas pipeline infrastructure with a capacity of 45 billion cubic meters per year, 10 BCM of it, the gasification of the northeastern regions of Kazakhstan, and 35 BCM to export to China. So a hell of a lot. And I've drawn this shitty little graph here about time and sanctions effect. The sanctions take a bit to kick in and then kick in, but after a while, then with Russia, with markets like this, they start to find other markets. And it's time for sanctions. It is slow, medium, quick, and then starts tapering off. And as I've said, that I think we're on this downtrend now. We're actually seeing the sanctions become less and less effective as time has gone on, and other markets are then found. So now what I want to go through is I might be eating some of my own words here, going on my predictions that I made earlier this year for now, 2024, now that we are at the end. My predictions for 2025, I think, may be summed up in this video right here. What people forget is the word mutually assured destruction, what means things go back the other way. I would just like to say, now I don't think this isn't my actual prediction, this is just, maybe you have a bit of a giggle about this, but I don't think people understand of how close to this we really, really are. We are one Franz Ferdinand sort of incident away from shit like that actually happening. The minutes to midnight is less than it has ever been. So let's look over this, and I might be then eating some of my words. Look at that beautiful mane of hair. But one thing I have shown from this is I do think that I have significantly increased my reporting ability from here.
A little bit of a breakdown of what I think will happen over the next year, over this year, as we see Russia's winter offensive.
Wait, I'm trying to speed this up. Speed, here we go.
Appears to be slowing down. Rybar talks about that.
So at
the Russians are saying that it is,
at this point in time, the Russian winter offensive was slowing down. Of course, then we saw it speed up throughout the year, just like I've predicted at the moment that through winter, poor conditions, things will then inevitably, in my opinion, armoured light infantry movements will slow down.
Down slower. And I thought I'd just put in my 2 cents for the next 12 months. And this will also give us somewhere to look back on, and maybe we'll get some things right. Maybe you can call me a knob. Either way, completely
You can do that.
fine. So the news and maps will be after this if you want to just scroll through. So I think in whole, I think 2024 will be very similar to 2023. The horizon of Russia's military industry and the weapons packages going into Ukraine, they're not, in my opinion, large enough to have some huge effect on the front line.
So I still believe that to be true. The industry capacity increase for both weapons going towards Ukraine and domestic for Russia, has it made just an absurd difference where one side's rolling over? No. Has Russia made a lot more ground this year than I predicted? Yes. The biggest thing for Russia has been its ability to recover manpower. The biggest problem for Ukraine has been its inability to recover or then strengthen the manpower within the country.
Short term, if we're talking 12 months short term.
So 12 months.
Any major huge announcements into Ukraine of weapons that would really break things up is going to take longer than 12 months. People talk about, Apaches, A-10s, these weapons. Now, there's an arguing point, would they break this up?
As we've seen, the F-16s have not broken this up, at least for the numbers that have been delivered.
But as well, the training for that is going to be a very long schedule too. So we're limited. Ourselves to this 12 months. And Russia's industry, yes, they're making some fighter jets, some helicopters, and some newer variants of artillery and updating tanks. But as far as, is there some big super weapon that's going to come out and do this? No. Are they going to be able to produce 50 Su-57s?
So Russia is meeting its losses of Su-34s at the moment. It's actually exceeding that. Of course, it's meeting that both with the Su-57. There's only been one lost on the ground. But as far as, the ability to produce 50 of these a bloody month and be able to be flying over Kiev? No, also. The industry has picked up, but it's not in a full war footing anywhere near what we have seen previously in wars, and therefore hasn't just shifted huge elements around and thousands of square kilometres per week.
Impact around the AD, not that many. So, yeah, I just don't think there's anything on the horizon.
The biggest one I'd say for the Russians is the use of fabs and the increased industry and production of Iskanders and the policy for the Iskanders. I actually put the policy at having more effect than the industrial increased capacity of Iskander.
It's like this, once that's there, it's all done and dusted. And I know that stalemate is not a word you're allowed to use. I'll add that to lists of words I'm not allowed to use online. But we've seen no net territorial change over the last 12 months.
Over the months before this, with Russian gains, the Ukrainian offensive, the net change was basically zero. This year has been significant in Russia's favour.
So net, I'm meaning as total. Ukraine made some, Russia made some in areas, but if you look on like the War Mappers updates, Surak updates of net overall, it's so close to having really no change that I can't see how you can't call that then that it's a stalemate, at least on the very front.
And Russia has been able to break this stalemate's probably not the best word for this, but what had happened there of just things grinding at each other, the positional battles, Russia has managed to break that and then move tens of kilometres in some areas.
We're going to have to see something break up these positions, and we're seeing a bit of this in the last, say, month.
What's breaking up these positions? Honestly, I think we could attribute a lot of this to, firstly, increased manpower, secondly, massive sacrifice of men, but thirdly as well, then use of untraditional artillery, and I would put Iskanders and Fabs actually in non-traditional artillery, and that has really helped breakthroughs in these areas.
With the huge increase of banned weapons, mainly the K-51.
So talk about increase on, and it still is very relevant. Things like K-51 gas grenades being used to try and clear out trenches. So guys run out of the trenches, then get hit, and they are being used systemically up and down the front line by both sides. There is video and photographic evidence of this happening.
Target revenue streams, infrastructure, Nord Stream, areas like this, dropped to disperse people out and then get out of the trenches, out of the holes, then hit with more regular type weapons. If you want a full breakdown on that, I've done a full interview with an engineer specifically about this use. And it won't surprise me to see attacks similar to the Novikovka Dam take place to try and break up the stalemate that's happening, and potentially more false flag attacks getting set up and will happen through the year.
So I believe throughout the year we have seen set up for false flags, some of which have not happened, others which may have happened and attributed we've missed it, but I still believe that is a highly likely piece that we will see towards the end of the war. The closer we get, the more likely that is of having false flags to undermine the other side or to justify then an action occurring from this.
Potentially as well. And this doesn't just mean inside the borders of Ukraine. It could be well outside of that to target revenue streams, infrastructure, Nord Stream,
exactly,
areas
that
like
has
this.
happened.
And I think both
then in Africa and in Syria as well, and in other sectors around the world, including, I believe, most likely that ship, the Ursa Major, was brought down by some level of SF team with some level of limpet mine carrying very important Russian parts in a very difficult position in the sea for Russia.
sides could be absolutely capable of conducting this, as well as further espionage. And we're
seen
going to
a
talk
lot of
later
espionage.
about how Russia has reborn a counter-espionage unit that hasn't been seen in action since
So
before.
Russia brought back SMERSH. At least at this point in time, we saw many photos of this. From here, we haven't actually really seen it, but these are counter-espionage teams. Of course, there's still a lot of espionage and targeted killings occurring in Russia too from the Ukrainian services. The Russian espionage is more looking at industrial sectors in Europe. Germany today, I think, has arrested 3 that they are on suspicion of espionage for Russia, but that is happening. And what we see on that would be just the tip of the iceberg then as well.
And like I said, I think we're going to see a huge increase in Ukraine partisan or spy actions, not within their own borders.
We don't see as much Ukrainian partisan actions I thought we would, and we haven't through this entire war in occupied areas, nowhere near the amount of partisan actions that I thought we would. And that is a byproduct too of how this war is grinding forward. A war of attrition grinding forward means that it moves very slow. So the people that stay in those towns and cities that get taken over, and that takes months or weeks to move through the city, there's a lot of people either killed, or those that stay want to be part of Russia. People don't remember that this actually happens too, or they're indifferent, and therefore a lot of people that may, patriots who may then act as partisans, aren't caught there. There's less of this as it grinds forward very slowly and is so exhausting. Now, it definitely happens, but nowhere near to the amount we saw in the beginnings in areas around Kherson as well. There's been a lot less of it, and that is a byproduct of an attritional war, is the exhaustion of the other side too. And this could play in Russia's favour the further and further this goes too. If there are uprisings of like partisans too, it will limit that for sure.
Actually within.
This is a problem when you take an area very quickly, is you can end up with a heap of people behind the line.
Russia's border, and making these more obvious to try and turn the populace there as well. Now, one thing that we know we're going to see are huge mobilizations into the hundreds of thousands of men across Ukraine and Russia.
So we haven't seen this, sort of. It's crazy that we have not seen what Zaluzny was putting forward of 500,000 Ukrainians need to be mobilised. Of course, we're seeing guys grabbed off the street all the time and conscripted against their will, and horrible things there too, but nowhere near to the amount that I thought they needed. I still think that they need. And back then, I was saying that this is critical that this happens, and now it is acute, and it is... I don't know if this can actually be done now in the time frame that as is left. To do this would take a long time. What Russia has done, instead of another conscription, what they have done is a massive incentive with money, so therefore hasn't. And I was being incorrect on a few points here already.
Any mobilisation like this is very unpopular. How many more mobilisations can actually happen to stay still?
So
on the
it
top
is,
of the front?
like I said, it's very unpopular, but what Russia has done is way less unpopular than grabbing guys off the street, because these are still volunteers who, of course, are enticed by money, but at the end of the day, they are still volunteers.
That is unknown. How big these mobilisations will be, we also don't know that. There's numbers of 500,000 floated. There's numbers of far below, far above that, but in time it will.
And that's exactly what Ukraine needed, is that amount.
Now, one thing that's guaranteed is that Ukraine will have its F-16s. Some will say that they're already there, but that's just speculation. Wait till we then see them. And this will help increase Ukraine's air capability for sure. But I mainly see it having a...
We haven't seen a measurable effect from those aircraft in an air defence role, seed and deed role, or anything rather than the PR victories of it. We have seen one of them shot down by we presume shot down by a Ukrainian AD system. But as far as the cost, the training time, everything of those, I believe that was probably a net negative, when what could have been done is fortifications, night visions, boots, radios, more men.
Large effect in the Black Sea against the Black Sea Fleet.
So this is what we thought. Once they came in, the Black Sea Fleet was getting to be way more picked off, as well as the Crimean Bridge. And we've seen realistically limited actions there.
As you to great effect, and the development of those as well. So let's have a look at the maps, and I'll show you what I am talking about, especially with these. So, the Black Sea Fleet, let's go down in Sevastopol.
So, of course, a lot of the Black Sea Fleet has moved, as I've said there. But the Black Sea Fleet is still pumping out Kaliber cruise missiles on a regular basis.
Black Sea, and target these ships, as well as missile targeting into the Kerch Strait, into the bridge there as well. Sort of isolating.
I'm surprised for PR the bridge hasn't been targeted more.
Then Crimea. And I think this will be very, very important. I can't believe that we don't see more attempts, more attacks on the Kerch Bridge here.
A year later, even just a PR, I can't believe that we haven't. I know militarily it's not very significant anymore, but still.
Maybe saving that, or maybe it is more difficult to strike than a lot of us would actually like to think, or that we actually think. But that's where I see the F-16s having then the most effect, and maybe on some areas in the south. But I think just the risks in flying these aircraft, and this is an F-16, they're a fantastic jet, don't get me wrong, but these are an older system. We are not talking an F-35, we're not talking an F-22, we are still talking an F-16. And I think the risks in flying these over contested airspace is hugely high. Now, Russia's Air Force may be nowhere near what was expected of the Russian Air Force.
Which we didn't, the Russian Air Force we thought would have more of an overmatch than it does. Does it have an overmatch? Absolutely. As much as we thought? No. Although many people point at me and go, that's a difference in how air superiority between Russian and Western doctrine works. I heard a good quote yesterday, actually from Kissinger, that said Russia is never as strong as they look and never as weak as they look. And I think many people should take that into account.
But Russia's air defence is still very deadly, and it still has a very large air force. And there's multiple systems of air defence that Russia has that has proven successful engagements of F-16s.
And Russia's air force has definitely improved through this war. They were, of all the different units working in the beginning of the war, they were the biggest letdown for the Russian Ministry of Defence, I believe, was the Russian Aerospatial Forces. But that has definitely improved. both in command, doctrine, strategy, and ability to deliver system on target.
Before. So it's not going to be invulnerable on the front line. It's still going to be vulnerable, and that's why I see most of the work here. But if you can isolate Crimea, it could be used to huge advantage. Now, this actually came out about in the Krinky from the Wagner Telegram. We're just going to read this.
So Wagner talking about then that the disappointment of
the traditional sense, yes,
Air Force, sorry.
Russia has not been able to gain air superiority. Yes, they've got dominance in areas, but not superiority. And I think it's very interesting here to hear that sort of firsthand about that it's, as they say, useless compared to other elements, and I guess from what they also then expected. And with this air works as well. I think one of the big ones is going to be the restrictions on Western weapons, that these F-16s, the weapons they fire, these are not going to be allowed to target inside.
So restrictions on Western weapons, that is still relevant, but it's not just the restriction, it's the amount of weapons given. The restrictions on ATACMS or Storm Shadows, whatever, may have been lifted, but if there's not the weapon there, well, that may as well have not been lifted.
Yes, there's some major shift in the actions and our SOPs delivering on these weapons into Ukraine, that if they can't strike outside of here, the seed and deed, so the suppression of enemy air defence and the destruction of air defence is going to be greatly limited, therefore actually making it more dangerous for these to fly in the sky, and of course limiting then the use of these. But it still will be very effective in the air, I'm sure, and very effective in an air defence role too, actually striking the cruise missiles coming into
That is the biggest
Ukraine.
thing I've been
and
incorrect.
Not only striking ones that have been fired from long-range strategic Russian bombers, but it will also then, if they can isolate the Black Sea Fleet, push it out, cut off the Kerch Bridge, it will limit the ability for that fleet to fire something like your caliber cruise missiles,
some
which are
humility here
targeting
of being very incorrect on that.
Ukraine. Now, as far as aid packages, I think Ukraine will get a large aid package from the US Congress. The $60 billion that Biden's trying to push through, I don't think it's going to be that much, but it will be a fair chunk, I believe, and we'll know that very soon. I think towards the end of the year, there will be more political pressure than ever as the US elections are coming.
Very correct on that. Towards the end of the year, which we are now, more pressure than ever with US elections, political pressure on Ukraine.
Through. Now, let's look at what map movements. I probably should have started here to keep people engaged, but I think Russia by spring will...
These are my predictions for then frontline mapping movements.
Have occupied probably a large amount of Avdiivka with very large losses.
So
they
they
not
will
have large losses like we saw in
occupy
Pokrovsk
Avdiivka with
like
large
so I think we're going to see Avdiivka, Novomalyv.
Now, what you can see on this map is this is Pokrovsk, this is Kurakhove, out in here. Obviously, where I've drawn in here is very different to where the map is sitting at the moment. Let me show you. So it was sitting, this is Donetsk in here, Marinka, and the map is right out in here. So that's where the map was sitting on this exact point in time. It's hard to see. Kurakhove was out here. Then we have Makiivka, you can just see the purple in here, and the map right out towards Pokrovsk. So it has moved a lot more than I predicted it would in this.
Livka, and also areas like Chasiv Yar. So I think what we'll see by the time Ukraine probably go on its offensive action, some degree, I don't know where.
So we were still thinking that Ukraine would have a level of offensive action this year from what we were hearing. We didn't realise how bad some of the munitions and manpower situation was, and how 2023 did jeopardise any 2024 offensive movements. And I think personally it's actually jeopardised any future offensive movements en masse. Also, the failure of that, the losses in that, but also that point not having success was the introduction of new weapons, the highest morale and the best trained that it was going to be at any point in time, and the most significant numbers also.
Look like this, whether it's going to look like this.
Way before what I thought you can see Osharetne out in here you're familiar with, that I thought it would cut down in here, but it is far beyond.
They are going to continue their push into Avdiivka as they are still making ground here. Yes, it has slowed down a bit as there's more pushback than ever, but I believe Avdiivka will be occupied to some degree, as well as this gap through here, as we do know Russia really want to close off this Novomalyivka from Mariinka.
So significantly different. This is down, then Ugledar front. Novomalyivka is way back in here. Sorry, I wanted to get this so if we can actually measure. So here to Uspanivka has moved some 22 kilometres. Novomalyivka, then this at the time wasn't occupied, all to here, 34 kilometres. Let's go from where it was sitting to the west of Avdiivka at the time to now is then 58 kilometres. That is very significant. Although, remember, this is non-strategically important, that it's moved 60 kilometres over the point of a year. But again, no, the lines aren't falling apart.
Pressure onto Ugledar. I think they'll close that as well as Avdiivka. And I don't know how, but there will be some push out towards Chasiv Yar. Of course, this is Bakhmut here. This area through here, this is very flat, open, hilly through here. So these defences here just get absolutely whacked by artillery. I think they'll try and increase their posturing in this area for the looming counteroffensive offensive by Ukraine.
So before Ukraine had we were stuck on this, that Ukraine would have another offensive, which has not occurred. But again, correct that Russia has tried to increase their position in Chasiv Yar, but Chasiv Yar, yes, but as far as dramatically different, no.
I'm not sure how much different these maps are going to look, but I don't believe that different. Let's say
I don't believe that different. It would look something
in the grand scheme of things
like this. Very incorrect. I wonder if just keep your eyes on this map for right now. Right? How do I do this? Okay, so this is the map today in this sector. Let's go back to December 31, 2023. there. Again, we're in 23. Let's go then to, oh, how do I do this? December. Yep. Let's go to the 31st being today. Significant. So I can't do that back and forward again, but you can see well beyond what I thought, eating some words there.
Mid-year. And I think that Russia will have then switched, and will currently as well, a huge focus on building defences against Ukraine's offensive.
Russia has still done that, something we don't talk about. They still are building and reinforcing fortifications, and of course, no one could predict Kursk.
I think too, we'll probably see Wagner, maybe not under that banner, but same, in some different areas, maybe in
So talking about use of private military contractors, we have seen that a little bit, but not to the degree of 2023.
In their most vulnerable spot, which is the south. That's where Ukraine really need to get, really want to get. And Ukraine, with the F-16.
Russia continue building fortifications in the south, as this is the most vulnerable spot, absolutely. If Ukraine, and this is why Ukraine pushed in out of Kyiv, to try and get to Melitopol, Tokmak, and split into a western and eastern element.
Maybe they'll cut off some amount of flow through Crimea into the south, disrupt that. And we still know that Ukraine has large stocks of Leopards, Abrams, and Charlies as well, and we'll try and push through here. But as we know, these lines, these defensive lines, they're going to be stronger than last year. That's it. I think we will see more of a breakthrough in this offensive than we saw last, because it's not just going to be focused along several fronts. They will put in one area,
this is where I'm
isolate that flow
incredibly wrong, saying that Ukraine's going to have an offensive, that they, instead of trying to push on many different areas along here like we have seen, focus in one spot and get to an area and then operate using that as a like a hub and lever off sort of the axis of that, rather than pushing in many areas. But like I've been saying throughout the year, is these positions are even more powerful than they were previously, and the Russian military, in my opinion, is actually in a better position than it was at this point in time, or in 2023 also. From
Crimea. And Ukraine was probing multiple fronts on their offensive. That's why we have this whole line of green down here. Yes, and if that were successful, would gain then the whole south under occupation for Russia. But when I hear the words airborne, amphibious in modern warfare, I think absolute aircraft in the sky.
I talk about how some are saying at that point in time, Russia's going to have an airborne or amphibious move on Odessa. And what I've said is, whether Russia have an amphibious move on Odessa or Ukraine try an amphibious move on Sevastopol, it's going to be an absolute bloodbath in modern war, with ISR, with machine guns, with whatever. Amphibious and para operations have been out of date for a hell of a long time, other than US Special Forces and military freefall, but that isn't large-scale infantry movements, that it would be a bloodbath. I have heard one person say the way for Sevastopol would be what he calls the reverse Dunkirk, except that you're going to have absolutely catastrophic losses, but you would eventually get some level of foothold down in here, but I don't see that happening, in my opinion, at all. So definitely, I was wrong 9 out of 10 on there, with offensives overestimating the effect of F-16s. But again, I believe, like I said in the beginning, that I have improved dramatically over this year in all of this. And thank you guys for coming along with everything this year with me. Good, bad, wrong, right, everything. I thank you very much. Have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you. I'll speak to you next year. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.